Hello, and welcome to our webinar where we'll discuss the origins of Pratt Whitney. This meeting is being broadcast and recorded over Teams. You may ask a question using the Q&A tool. Now I'd like to introduce Jim Speich, who will tell you a little bit about the DEA and moderate today's discussion. Jim?
Well, welcome to today's Dependable Engines Association webinar. We're taking it here from the New England Air Museum again. We really appreciate being here. Mike Thornton is here. He's the curator here. Tiana Darling was helping us. She's like the clerk of the works, I think. And we're sitting under this wing of the VS-44, which is a just amazing airplane. And of course, we're here, and behind us is a replica of Andrew Willagoose's garage. Rick will get into more about that, but it's a replica that was built here for the 100th anniversary celebration. So Mike and the team at New England Air Museum, I really appreciate it. Dependable Engines Association is a group of retired, current employees from Pratt Whitney that really want to bring together and share knowledge between us older folk and the current people that work there today. Amazing statistic, which I just heard the other day, and I see it on this slide, 37% of the employees and people have less than 5 years experience. So we really seen that our job is really to let them appreciate the history that made the company that they're working at today. And I think the 100th anniversary was really fantastic. All the things we did, I hope everyone enjoyed that. On this slide you see in front of you, you can see there's a couple QR codes there. Scan to join and scan to learn more about us. But we're trying to bring together and understand the rich history that Pratt Whitney has. But more importantly, we've got to get on because Rick Warters has a tremendous amount of information for us today. The last webinar he had was with Jimmy Reed, where he explained about how the Wasp Engine worked. And he did a great job with that. And we were again here at the New England Air Museum. But Rick's going to give us a little bit different look at it. He's going to be kind of before the engine was built. What was the Rensselaer family doing, and how did that all come about up until the engine was first run in Hartford? Well, let me give you a little background on Rick. This is the first time I had met Rick. When I worked there, I heard his name all the time, and it was always good. But Rick studied industrial and labor relations at Cornell and came straight to Pratt Whitney after graduation in 1984. 35 years and 3 stints at Pratt later, he retired as United Technologies Corporate Vice President of Employee and Labor Relations. Rick has traveled around the world. He's always struck by how few people understood the impact of our company's founders had in building the foundation for the American aviation industry that we know today. And after looking at the history and working on the 100th anniversary, it's true. I mean, that is a true statement. No one really understands what Pratt did for the aviation. Labor relations and history go hand in hand. Rick has a passion for both. Pratt Whitney was Rick's real first job, and the company's founder's story was never been told in detail. Rick decided it was time. He started researching the story in earnest in early 2024 with a trip to Hamilton, Ohio. You'll hear more about Hamilton as we go along here. He is now 400 unedited pages into a book that will trace Fred Rensselaer and his many connections through the first WASP to the creation of United Aircraft and Transportation Group, and through that company's 1934 divestiture into Boeing, United Airlines, and United Aircraft. So without further ado, Rick's got a lot of great information here today. We'll have to watch him on his timing, but Rick, welcome. We really appreciate you being here today.
Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure. And, I appreciate being here at the Air Museum. This is a great spot to do this from. And I think on the line, we've got a couple of folks I want to give a shout out to. One is Tom Rensselaer. So Fred Rensselaer's great nephew. He's been a great resource and a great person to talk to about sort of the Hamilton, the very early history. And Howard Wright. Howard was at the Renbrook School for a lot of years, just recently retired. And in addition to his academic responsibilities, he was their historian. And he's got a real interesting insight into sort of Fred Rensselaer and the leadership perspective that Rensselaer brought. And he tried to share with the kids in the school. So I'm glad to have them along. As Jim said, I am as of yesterday, 459 pages into a book on Mr. Rentschler, and I'm all the way to January 6th of 1926. So while we've been celebrating the 100th anniversary of Pratt & Whitney, what I'm going to focus on is sort of everything before that. And we're going to look at it in what I call 7 easy parts. And I will move very quickly along the way. So if questions come up, please send them through. We'll try and address them. I'll address them after the fact if we don't get to them today. The first part in this segment is I call the cash. And the cash is really because National Cash Register was known as the cash in Dayton, Ohio. And it plays a really interesting role that very few people understand. So Fred Rentschler was born in 1887, and he was born to George Adam, I'll call him Old Adam Rentschler, and Phoebe Schwab Rentschler. Adam's story in and of itself warrants a book. Absolute rags to riches story. He came here to the United States as an infant with his widowed father and his siblings, and he was orphaned not long after that. And so from being sort of sent into the foundries in Newark, New Jersey, he learned a trade that would take him through the rest of his life and influence not only his family, but the whole aviation world at the end of the day. So the family business that Fred was born into was this set of different businesses. The original Ohio Foundry, which is the one on the top there, the Phoenix Caster Company, which made just what it sounds like, casters for everything from furniture to moving industrial supplies and everything else. Hooven, Owen, and Rentschler, which is sort of the big picture on the bottom. They made the Hamilton coreless engine, which was a steam-powered way of generating electricity. And then the gray iron castings business came up with the Hamilton Foundry and Machine Company shortly after Fred was born. Now, why all this is important and how it ties into Pratt is the real trick. So on one day in 1887, the country was in recession, and Adam was looking for some additional business to keep the men in his foundries occupied. He was in Dayton, Ohio, calling on a customer, and he asked if they had any recommendations for other work that could be done. And they sent him to this upstart business on the second floor, an industrial block in Dayton, Ohio. So Fred called on the business, or George called on the business, and he said, I do foundry stuff. He said, I do castings. What can I do for you? And they said, well, we do need some parts. And they gave him the specs, and he said, I'll be back tomorrow. Now, Dayton, Ohio is about 30 miles from Hamilton. And at the time, if you took the Cincinnati, Hamilton, Dayton Railroad, it would take you about 2 hours to get from Hamilton to Dayton and vice versa. So old Adam gets back on the train, goes back to his foundry, takes the specs for the parts, has his guys work through the night, and the next day he shows back up at this company with a casting in hand. That's pretty remarkable. It would be even more remarkable today, but for the time, it's absolutely amazing. And what that did is 2 things. The first is industrial. So it endeared him with the guy who ran the business, and that was John Patterson, who ran the National Cash Register Company. From an industrial standpoint, that gave the Rentschlers volume for their foundries for decades to come. So that was the basis for the wealth that was going to be generated. In addition, it created connections. And throughout this conversation, we're going to be talking about connections like the 2 that came from National Cash Register. The first was a guy named Edward Deeds, and the second was Charles Kettering. Now, you're going to find Deeds throughout this. But the interesting thing that the 2 of these guys did, Deeds ran the shop, and he brought Kettering in to do electrical engineering for him as electrification was starting to take over America. And what he needed him to do was to take the cash register arm and replace the lever with an electrical motor. That was Kettering's idea. Shortly after they figured out how to do that, they're watching the automotive industry grow in the country. And Deeds says, I want to do something in automotive. And he and Kettering form a company that we would now know as Delco. Well, what they did is, if you can turn a cash register and replace the lever, then you can probably replace the lever that's going to start a Model T with a starter and ignition system. And that's what they came up with, and that was the founding of their company called Delco. Why is that interesting? Well, first of all, Deeds went to the Wright brothers and said, hey, we've got this new ignition system that'll take care of your ignition problems. Well, Orville and Wilbur looked at him and said, yeah, but that's the one problem we don't have right now. And so they sort of sent him packing. But it created a friendship there that would pull Deeds into the aviation industry for years to come. So we've got this relationship now because Adam Rentschler is dealing with John Patterson and with Deeds and with Kettering as they're coming up with work that needs to be done. And Deeds is talking about the automotive industry. And Fred is growing up around all these guys. And there's stories about Deeds and Kettering being at Sunday dinner with the Renchlers. And you can just imagine these industrialists coming into your house and the implications that it's got for a young guy. And so Fred grows up, and he grows up in the shops. And as soon as they were of age, the boys were expected to go in. So he's got 3 brothers and a sister from this family. And all 3 of them, or all four of the brothers went into the shops. They learned the business, and Fred gravitated toward the shop portion. His older brother, Gordon, gravitated toward the offices. He liked the finer things. Fred was happy to get his hands dirty. It's what he did. But as with his other brothers, all 4 of them went to Princeton. So in 1905, in the fall of 1905, when Fred goes to Princeton, he goes, and 2 of his older brothers are already there. The one I really want to highlight is Gordon, his older brother. Gordon was an extrovert. Gordon was a joiner. Gordon was an officer in every single club that he ever joined. Fred was not. Fred was the opposite. Fred was an introvert. He was not a joiner. He focused on his studies, finished in the top 20% of his class. His favorite subject was history, and he graduated with a degree in letters. Interestingly enough, when you look at that whole senior class of 250 some people, Fred and one other person were 2 who sort of deviated from what their favorite sport was. And Fred said automotive was his favorite thing. Okay, now harken back. We got Deeds and we got Kettering sitting around the Sunday dinner, and we've got this automotive industry that's kind of booming. And so Adam Rentschler, Fred's father, says, okay, we'll buy in. He's got a son who's really interested. And so they start a car company called the Republic Motor Car Company. Fred is on paper, he's first the treasurer, then the secretary treasurer. Old Adam, his father, is the president. One of their neighbors is also a vice president. Gordon, his older brother, is a director. But Fred is really sort of the shop superintendent. His job is to get that shop up and running, and that's what he did when he got out of Princeton, his first job. And he described it very much as hands-on. He said, I was very much a molder and mechanic. That's what Fred did. So he was shop superintendent, but he was right into the thick of it. So the challenge for Fred and the challenge and some interesting things with the connections comes a couple years later. The Republic Motor Car Company builds a couple of hundred cars over the course of 1909 to 1913. Not many more than that. There have been estimates as high as 2,000. It was not that high. They were building a car intended to compete with the Packard. Yeah. So it was a high quality. They built the chassis. They bought all the rest of the parts. And so that's what they were doing. In my view, hard to make money doing that because their reputation was so important in the town, they couldn't violate that. Yeah. It had to be a quality product. And so they put it out there. Well, in March of 1913, there's a deluge. And the Miami River rises. And it comes through Dayton, and it washes down through Hamilton, and it wipes out these cities. Just a terrible, terrible inundation. And so we end up with 2 things again. One is to the industry, and the other is to the connections or the relationships. From an industry perspective, on the map that you've got here, you see the family's businesses and the house. So what happens is Huvenowen and Rentschler, which is the green factory on the left-hand side closer to the river, and it's in the picture on the upper right-hand side. Huvenowen and Rentschler gets water flowing through it, but it's repairable. And oh, by the way, the investment in that business is such that they really don't have any choice. They've got to get that thing back up and running, building the Hamilton coreless engine, and they do that. The original business, the Ohio Foundry, is the one that was closest to the hydraulic races, because back in the day, it was run by water power. It was back before everything was happening. The water that rushed through the hydraulic races wiped out anything anywhere close to them. The Ohio Foundry was done. It could not be repaired. It had to be abandoned. And the factory next to it, which was the Phoenix Caster Company, that was also wiped out. So what do? You're not going to abandon these businesses. The Renschlers have an industry to maintain. And so they look at the foundry business and they say, well, we've got this other foundry across town, and they immediately elect contracts to build the size of that foundry to take that business in. Makes sense. They did it, and they moved remarkably fast. I mean, within a month, there were contracts out for a new building. Then they've got the Phoenix Caster business. Well, let's face it, the Republic Motor Car Company is fun, but it's not the breadwinner for the Renschler industrial business. And so they take the Phoenix Caster Company and they put it in the business that is the Republic Motor Car Company. That's Fred's business, where he's the superintendent, where he's running it. We know he wanted to do automotive stuff, but it just wasn't in the cards. And so Fred becomes the superintendent now of the Phoenix Caster Company as we move from 1913 into 1914, when, of course, what happens is World War I starts to heat up overseas. In the Miami River Valley, in order to make sure that never again would they be faced with the kind of devastation that they suffered in 1913, the whole community rallied. The entire community. They came together and they formed this thing called the Miami Conservancy District in order to build levees and dams and retaining ponds and pools and lakes to make sure that they would never be flooded out again. In order to do that, Hamilton's mayor immediately reached out to the industrial leader of his age of the time, which was Fred's older brother, Gordon. Gordon accepts that, and then he's the logical one to go on the board of the Miami Conservancy District. The guy from Dayton, John Patterson from NCR, ponies up a guy named Edward Deeds. These names are starting to sound familiar, right? I mean, it's the same guys. So now Gordon and Edward Deeds are on the Miami Conservancy District together, and the relationship that had started over Sunday dinner at the family's house, all of a sudden got very, very real. One other important relationship that happens here is that the Miami Conservancy District did what was the largest industrial conservation project of its time. And they did it without any state or federal money. They did it by issuing bonds, which is pretty remarkable. Well, somebody needed to go get someone else to float those bonds. Yeah. Gordon went to New York, met with the National City Bank, and sold the idea. National City Bank signed up, and they floated the bonds, and they left impressed with this guy, Gordon Renschler. And I know I still haven't talked much about Fred, and I haven't talked about an engine, but we'll get there. So now the war comes along. 1914, Europe enters the war. The United States, there's great contention in the United States from the contingent that wants to stay out and the contingent that thinks we need to support our allies. And during this time, we run into another thing, which is Wilbur Wright has died. Orville has now taken over the company, and he decides he's had enough. So in 1915, he sells to a group of New York financial guys. And as the war moves on, they start to look at it, and the financial guys say, okay, well, we need some more stuff. And they buy an automotive company that's got operations in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and they do a deal with Glenn Martin. And so the Wright Company becomes the Wright-Martin Company for the war period, okay? Now, we finally get into the war in 1917. So one of the first things that comes out is that the United States government is trying to figure out, how do we turn our production machine into something that can support the war effort fast, right? Because Europe's been in the deal for 2.5, almost 3 years, and we haven't really done anything to ramp up. How do we get ramped up as quickly as possible and have this make sense? And so they look to 6 industrialists from across the United States, one of whom is Edward Deeds. So Mr. Deeds goes to Washington, and Mr. Deeds sits on the Munitions Standards Board. And after about a month, he decides that sitting on this board with no power is really not for him. And he says, we need to do something else. And so they put him on the aircraft production board instead. Now, for those of you who know anything about World War I engine production, the Liberty engine might ring a bell. So the Liberty engine was actually sketched out over that weekend in Mr. Deeds' hotel suite in Washington. He had his fingerprints all over it, and everybody knew it. That gets him appointed to the Signal Corps as a colonel. So now he's in the Signal Corps with responsibility for aircraft procurement. That's where Mr. Deeds is. About that same time, young Fred registers for service and is commissioned to go into the service. Now, young Fred with a silver spoon in his mouth, it's probably not surprising he wasn't sent to the trenches. He actually ended up in the Signal Corps underneath Mr. Deeds, now Colonel Deeds. Several layers underneath him, but that's where he was. And what Fred did is he went to be what was called an inspector, but I think we need to be careful about how we think about that. He was an inspector at the Wright-Martin, New Brunswick factory. What he did was he replaced a French colonel or a French officer who was responsible for overseeing production and quality. So this is not just a guy who's out there looking at parts. Yeah. This is a guy who's looking at the system to make sure the government is getting what the government is supposed to be getting, and the quality of the output is what they've contracted for. So he's got a very broad purview. And this is a guy who really likes to understand things. Fred is nothing if not intellectually curious. I mean, this is a guy who is smart, he is shop savvy, and he digs in to what's going on at Wright-Martin. That's his deal. He digs in deep. And so Wright-Martin had sent their chief engineer, a guy named Henry Crane, over to Europe to look at all the engines in Europe and figure out how could Wright-Martin participate in this war effort. And they had begun to produce the Hispano-Suiza engine, water-cooled V8 engine, 200 to 220 horsepower, used in SPADs and other fighting biplanes at the time. I mean, pretty cool product and a really good engine. Well, they had brought it back and they had started to build it, but it wasn't until 1917 that they really started to ramp things up. And the financial guys that were running the company hired another company called Gaethels. It was Gaethels, Jameson, Houston, and Jay as consultants to come and run the company. So General Gaethels, who was appointed president, was also the general who had just finished making the Panama Canal. So this is a big guy. You know, they're putting him somewhere that he can do some good. He didn't really do much hands-on. A guy named George Houston did much of that. Now, that's interesting because Houston comes from Lexington, Kentucky, which is right across the river from Cincinnati, which is 30 miles from Dayton. And his father ran a foundry business, and they knew the Renchlers. So now George Houston is running Wright-Martin and the factory in New Brunswick, where Fred, as an officer, is responsible for overseeing production for the government. The two of them get to know each other very well. This gets to be important because you can see Fred says, we developed production from 4 motors a month in 1917 to 1,000 motors 16 months later. 1,000 motors a month was the production capability. Think about the remarkable achievement that was to get where things were going. So, armistice. You know, there are great things that come out of war and there are terrible things that come out of war. The first thing that happens is the axe falls on all the contracts. So that's the image on the left. The axe fell. Contracts dried up. They went away. Businesses that had entered the war to support the effort were washed out. The automotive companies that were out there and producing the Liberty engine, they packed up, went back to Detroit, but for Packard. And so that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is this remarkable surplus of all of this stuff that we built, by the way, not much of which found its way into service in World War I, or even found its way over to foreign shores. And so you've got things like this ad from the Curtiss company, where you could get instruction and a plane for $500. And if you want an engine to go on that plane, it was going to cost you an extra $750. But for $1,250, you could have a Curtiss Jenny with a Curtiss engine and flight instruction, and you could be off on your own. Enter the age of the barnstormer, right? So that's what happened. But to put this in perspective, they were selling planes brand new, still in the crates, for 10 cents on the dollar. I'm just insane. And they're flooding the market. Well, that's not good news if you're a manufacturer. So now I don't have contracts and the market's being flooded. But the good news for guys like Rentschler were people were starting to see that aviation had changed fundamentally. There were different purposes for airplanes than people had envisioned prior to World War I. And one of the things that happens is this Five Nations Treaty, where the Navy, because battleships played such a big part in World War I, the nations came together and said, we will limit the amount of tonnage that each of these countries can have in battleships. And countries can also have these things called aircraft carriers. Well, the U.S. didn't have any aircraft carriers, so we turned to Collier into the Langley, which was the first aircraft carrier, and the Navy all of a sudden starts to think differently about airplanes, aircraft, and particularly the power. I need lighter, I need more power, I need all of those things. It's a really different calculus. So that's what goes on there. Now we've got this industry in turmoil. And how are we going to make something of it? That's the next trick. And so we've got Wright Martin. Glenn Martin was very disenchanted, went his own separate way. The automotive, the car company, the factory that they had in New Brunswick was sold to Mack Truck, and they needed a new home. So George Houston, who was actually the guy running the company, went to Fred Rentschler and he said, hey, I know you. I've seen what you can do. Fred has actually shown his mettle. I think we can say that time as an officer in New Brunswick is when Fred finally stands on his own. He steps out from behind the shadow of his older brother, and there he is. And people can see what he can bring to the party. George sees it. George does know the family and the reputation. That's good. He says, why don't you come along with me? We're going to establish Wright Aeronautical. We're going to be an engine company. And we're going to take this forward. You come to me as soon as we get it established, then it's yours. You'll be the president. And that's what happens. So Wright Aeronautical has two things, two real big assets. The first one is that they had built the heck out of the Hispano-Suiza engine and they had Americanized it and they made it probably the best engine on the market of the time. Don't tell anybody who had a Liberty engine, but I think their engine was the engine of the time. The other thing that they owned the original Wright patent for planes. And the reason that's important is that when you think about all of this surplus coming into the market, you understand the importance of having that patent. So companies were looking to places like Britain, which was starving for cash and was happy to sell anything that they had left over from the war. Companies wanted to buy that surplus and bring it into the U.S. as if we didn't have enough of our own. Well, George and Fred exercised the Wright patent to say, no, those planes violate the Wright patent. They can't be used in the United States, and they shut it down. So there was an injunction against bringing all that extra surplus into the United States. So that helped preserve a core of the industry. So we've got that patent and frankly that stature in the industry that goes with the name, and we've got this really strong engine that's going great. The problem is that the Navy decided that that's not exactly what they needed anymore, and the Army and the Navy put out a contract for an air-cooled engine, and they went to Wright, and Wright indeed in 1921 built a big air-cooled engine. So they built the R1. So this is Fred Rentschler as president and George Meade as his chief engineer. And they built the R1, 350 horsepower, 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engine at 884 pounds. So that is the first successfully tested large engine in the United States. Fred Rentschler and George Meade. I want to be clear, it's not because of a vision, it's because a customer asked them to do it. Now the customer says, we like that, there's a problem, the head resistance, this great big thing has too much resistance when it's flying, and it's not going to overcome the weight. And so we don't think we can go with 350 horsepower, but we'd like a 200 horsepower engine, air-cooled radial. And right, we don't want you to make it. We got this other guy who's been making 28 horsepower air-cooled engines for a training aircraft called the Penguin, which, by the way, doesn't leave the ground. It's got stubby wings, and it's a ground trainer. So they turn to Charles Lawrence and the Lawrence Aero Engine Company, and they say, make us this engine. Well, Lawrence builds one. He goes back to the loft on the West 40s in New York, and he designs and builds this engine. Charles Lawrence is often known as the father of the air-cooled radial engine in the United States. It's fair. And he goes back and he builds this engine and he delivers it. Well, he delivers it to the Navy and it doesn't work all that great, but they've got a race coming up and they spend time perfecting it and the engine works. Well, not only does it work, but they go to Detroit with it and they win the Curtiss Marine Cup trophy. And so now they're really enamored with this Charles Lawrence air-cooled radial engine. They say, we want 50 more. And then they go to Lawrence's place of business and they find out, you're not going to build anything. Well, Lawrence never did. He contracted for production. And so the Navy now has an engine that they really want.
Yep.
And they got nowhere to get it from because Lawrence can't do it. And so they go to Curtiss, they go to Glenn Curtiss and they say, hey, build this engine. And Curtiss says, not interested. I got my own. Curtiss built engines for his aircraft mostly. That was his deal. He had his thing. And he was deeply ingrained with the Army. Not interested in your thing. They then come to Fred and they say, okay, Mr. Rentschler, we want you to do this. And he looks at him and he says, no, we built this 350 horsepower engine. We can build you a 200 horsepower engine that will knock your socks off. We'll build our own. Well, the Navy goes away and then they come back and they say, we don't think you understand. We're going to air-cooled engines. And you know that Hispano-Suiza derivative that you're making all your money on? We're not buying it anymore unless you build this air-cooled engine. At the same time, Charles Lawrence's single largest benefactor was his brother-in-law, a guy named William Averill Harriman, who was later governor of New York and Secretary of State. He was also he was well connected to the Navy as a result of his being a shipping magnate. And he was well connected in New York financial circles. So he was talking to Rentschler's board. And the board says, geez, Fred, we understand you think you can build a better engine, but go find a way. This is the cheap way in. It's what the Navy wants. Go do it. And so Wright Aeronautical buys the Lawrence Aero Engine Company, brings Charles Lawrence on board, and William Averill Harriman onto the board of directors. So Fred's board of financially focused directors just got more heavily focused that way. Over the course of the next couple of years, actually from 1923 to 1924, George Meade, Andrew Wilgoose, everybody that we know from our heritage, puts all of their effort into turning Charles Lawrence's J1 into the J2, the J3, and by the time Fred Rentschler leaves in September, the J4, which we all know as the Whirlwind. Okay, Fred Rentschler and George Meade and their team built that engine. They turned Lawrence's, I'm not quite sure how to say it politely, but a not wonderful piece of equipment into a world beater. But Fred was left with these finance guys who still would not buy into the fact that they could do better. He knew, George Meade knew, that there was a better engine to be had that could fundamentally change the way the world thought about aviation. That's what he wanted to do. And he was tired dealing with the finance guys, and he needed an operation. I still don't know what that operation was. It has been described as a mean operation. And so under that cover, Fred resigns in September of 1924 from Wright Aeronautical. And at the bottom of this quote, you'll see what he said. He said, finally, it reached a point where I was discouraged enough to feel that I should give it up and return to Hamilton. He didn't say to go build a better engine.
Right.
He said, I'm going to go home to Hamilton. Well, it's not what he ends up doing, fortunately for all of us. But nonetheless, in his head, that's where he is. He takes the next several months to recover. But before we think about that, we got to ask, why can Fred go back to Hamilton? Wasn't he going to be in Gordon's shadow? And the answer is no, because back in Hamilton, Gordon was running the family's biggest businesses, and that Hamilton Corliss engine that's over on the left had sort of run its course. Electrification had caught on. You didn't need to make your own. And during World War I, Huvenowen and Rentschler changed their product mix to make 3,500 horsepower steam engines for maritime use. So these are monstrous engines for ships. And they were turning out 4 a week from their factory. So these are not small businesses. As the war ends, the same thing that aviation ran into, they were going to run into. Steam is no longer the way forward. By this time, diesel is replacing steam. What do we do? Well, the cool thing was that with the steam power, you could take that machine and drop it anywhere. So they came up with the idea to build sugarcane crushers that were run on these steam engines. And when you come out of a war, like World War I, where there's rationing and everything else, you can find yourself in a boom, and there was a sugar boom. And so Gordon went to Cuba, and he sold these sugar crushing machines that are like half the size of a football field all over Cuba to the plantations. And so Gordon's doing that. That's going to become really important because when there's a boom, there's also a bust, almost always. And sugar crashed. And Gordon was still doing okay. He had made deals that worked. So it was still tough. The plantations were suffering. But National City Bank comes to Gordon and they say, we are really exposed in Cuba on all this sugar. Can you help us understand and figure out how we can get our investments back? Gordon says, sure. Well, that leads to Gordon becoming a director at National City Bank. It then leads to him being promoted to the position of assistant to the bank president and heir apparent. And now he's at National City Bank. He's out of Hamilton. He's spending most of his time in New York. At the same time, because of that role, Gordon ends up as a director on a company called Niles Beament Pond. For those of us here, one of Niles Beament Pond's subsidiary companies is a company called Pratt Whitney. They make machine tools. Okay. So that's 1924. By February of 1925, another guy is also on the board of Niles Beament Pond. His name is Colonel Edward Deeds. Okay, so we're starting to put the picture together. So Fred is recuperating. During his recuperation, he goes through this, and this is from his book. And I think it's really important because as we sit here underneath the wing of a huge Sikorsky, we think about Igor having been this visionary from the time he was, this big. Fred was a pragmatic guy. He understood how things work. That was Fred. He's thinking through this. He's not going to rush into anything. He's thinking through it. He says, you know what? Aviation makes me happy. Aviation, well, good. Happy is good. And the best planes can only be made out of the best engines. I believe that in my heart of hearts. And the industry is sort of mid-cycle. There's this evolution between air-cooled or between liquid-cooled to air-cooled that's moving. And the Navy clearly is all over this. But we have to stay away from these big engines, the well-developed liquid-cooled engines that are being made by Glenn Curtiss and are being made by Packard. We're not going to try and mess with them. Those are the big dogs, and they're too well steeped in what they're doing to try and crack into that market. But George Meade tells me that we could do 400 to 500 horsepower with an air-cooled radial. So his idea. Now we get to the idea. We're now at the beginning of 1925. Fred Rentschler says, I want to make a more efficient radial than any yet conceived. Now we've got the idea. 1925, 100 years ago. And who's he got? Who's he got on his side? Well, he's got Gordon. Gordon knows how to get the money. Gordon's got the path. Edward Deeds, Colonel Deeds understands industry like nobody understands industry. He can put it together. George Meade has the engines. George spent a year at McCook Field with exposure to every single engine that was produced by the Allies for the war. He had it all right up here. This guy had the ideas. And Chance Vaught was Fred's buddy. Chance Vaught was an aviator. Fred describes him as the best designer of the era. I think he probably was. His aircraft are phenomenal. This is his team. These are the guys that throughout his recuperation he's talking to that bring him to this idea of that better engine. And so I will tell you that there is no coincidence in industry. Chance Watt goes to the Navy, and Chance is usually this very dapper kind of guy, and he goes in and he cries poor mouth in sort of a tattered kind of a jacket. And he says, hey, Admiral Moffett, you know, my shops are about empty. I'm going to have to close down if you don't give me some business. And Moffett says, well, build a better plane. We'll give you more business. And Watt says, well, give me a better engine. I'll build you a better plane. Moffett says, well, what do you need? And he listens to him. Well, within a month, who's knocking on Moffett's door but Fred Rentschler? And Fred Rentschler says, I got this idea for a better engine. And Moffett says, you know what? Chance Watt needs a better engine. No, what a shock, right? Chance Watt needs a better engine. So Moffett details what Chance Watt needs, much to the surprise, I'm sure, of Mr. Rentschler. So the two of them start going back and forth. Now Fred talks to his brother and he says, how are we going to put this together? And Gordon says, geez, I love how these coincidences are presented. Gordon's been a director for over a year for Niles Beam and Pond. And he says, gee, this company that I know happens to have a surplus of space up in its factory in Hartford, and they got a surplus of cash coming out of World War I. And he said, I think that could work. And so they put the two together. And Fred Rentschler gets on a train and he comes up. He goes to New York first and he meets with a guy named James Cullen. James Cullen runs Niles Beam and Pond. He's also the president of Pratt Whitney. James Cullen happened to run the Niles Tool Works, which was literally across the railroad tracks from Hooven, Owen, and Rentschler in Hamilton, Ohio. The family had known James Cullen since the early 1900s. Cullen says, geez, this sounds like a good idea. Now, never mind that the guy on his board of directors, Gordon, has told him it's a good idea. And Edward Deeds, who also happens to be on his board, told him it's a good idea. Let me introduce you to Bert Cullen up at Pratt Whitney. He's the general manager. Fred goes to Hartford. He pitches it. Now, Cullen's no dummy. He's two directors and the president of his company have said, we think this is a good idea. He thought it was a good idea. And so they agreed. So they come forward this. The one other thing that gets to be remarkable is that before a deal is struck, Edward Deeds is put in the position essentially to run Niles Beam and Pond. Then the decision is made. And so the deal makers are Deeds, Rentschler, Cullen, Pratt and Whitney. At Pratt and Whitney, it's Cullen and C.R. Burt. Deeds runs the concern, and this is the deal. So they get together and Niles Beam and Pond through Pratt and Whitney agrees to commit $2 million. $250,000 up front for the development of the engines. They issue 20,000 shares of common stock. 50% goes to Niles Beam and Pond, 50% to the management. That's two people. That's Fred Rentschler and George Meade, 55-45. Their contribution to the deal is a whopping $500. Okay? So for their $500 and their intellectual property, they've got $2 million committed. Pretty good deal if you can get it. You got to have a heck of a reputation to do it. They strike the deal. They create the space. And they start to clear it out. And before they even do that, in the June timeframe, in a garage like this, in Andrew Wilgoose's garage, George Meade and Andrew start to lay out what that new engine is going to look like. And so they spend time in the garage, and they do that through June, and they do that through July. And in August, the guys move to Hartford. Yep. And so on August 3rd, these 8 folks converge with an idea. They've got 3,000 square feet of space on the 3rd floor of an industrial building in Hartford. They've got 3 offices, a drafting room, and an experimental shop. And they've got one goal. And that is that by Christmas Eve, they're going to have this engine that started out on a drafting board in a building like this. They're going to have it built. And that was the single goal. And I love Fred Rentschler's quote, because if you're hearing anything throughout this, nobody does this alone, right? I mean, he does it with connections. He does it with a team. He does it with people who know what they're doing. These are remarkably qualified people for their jobs, filled with ambition, and they wholeheartedly believed in each other and the future of the company. Thank God, because we all benefit from that. And so over the course of the next couple of months, this is the remarkable move. Pen goes to paper in June. The first employee is put on at the end of July. By August, the design is practically complete. Detailed drawings are out in September. And by October, the engineering work is essentially done. By October, Fred is talking about the next engine, right? Fred has gone from the hands-on guy to the executive who's saying, I'm worried about the next project. You guys got this. I mean, that's amazing. From a manufacturing perspective, they clean out the place in July. The tobacco's got to get moved. The experimental shop gets laid out. Forgings start coming in from Wyman Gordon up in Worcester at the time. Manufacturing starts both at the aircraft and in Pratt Whitney Tool Company. Almost all material was received. And by November, again, no report on manufacturing. They got this. Fred's worried about getting a contract with the Navy and getting the money coming in. And when you put all this together, the last bolt, there's a missing two there. I've got to remember that. The last bolt was December 22nd of 1925. So the engine finally comes together on December 22nd. And Colonel Deeds had said, if you do it by Christmas Eve, there's a turkey in it for everybody. And December 22nd, last bolt goes in. December 23rd, the engine goes on the stand. It doesn't run until the 29th. But the deal was, if you got it done by Christmas Eve, and they did. And so Mrs. Meade and Mrs. Rentschler went down to the store and they packaged all of the turkeys. And on Christmas Eve, they went into the factory and delivered all the turkeys that they had packaged up to everybody who worked there. And they put it on Colonel Deeds' account. And so that is, I think the thing that I just want to close with is these days we think about the founder story. And you think about the infallibility and the remarkable brilliance of these guys. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, the remarkable thing about Fred Rentschler was not that he was brilliant. He was a really smart guy. There's no question about that. But he understood how to bring things together. He understood the importance of relationships. He understood the importance of bringing people into his business who really knew what they were doing, right, and who were committed to doing a really good job to delivering that better engine and to moving an industry forward.
Yeah.
And that's my story.
Well, very interesting. I just thought it was fantastic. We always start the story here at Pratt where he got $250,000 from Pratt Whitney Tool and off he went. But you don't really know. And I think before you mentioned about Gordon being really the financier behind this whole thing, kind of like behind the scenes, right?
Yeah.
And how he grew up as the part of the whole Rentschler family. It's just, it's just remarkable. And Fred learning all of this as he was a kid.
Right.
Right.
And I think that's the amazing thing. The exposure to those shops, the exposure to the different businesses, and seeing those industrialists having conversations at your dining room table,
right?
Just had to be astounding.
Right.
Just had to be.
Yeah.
And in a time when, as they started to talk about aviation, when, the Wrights get the first contract in 1908. I mean, it was, it was nothing until then.
And that's where a lot of the aviation people learn about aviation is through their families.
Yeah.
Small example is my uncle worked for Bell out of Niagara Falls, New York, and they made the rocket engines for the Nike missiles.
There you go.
He took me down there 2 or 3 times on a Saturday to see him light off these missiles. And from then I was just stung by the bug.
The die was cast.
It was it, But it was interesting during your speech, and we don't have any questions that have come in as of yet, but the whole thing about the automotive, right? So it comes around, goes around. In the beginning, it was the Republic and building it and the Rentschler being involved in that. And then UTC, right, with UT Automotive. It just kind of struck a bell to me that, wow, the whole thing came back around again. I wonder what Fred would have thought with UTC Automotive, right?
Yeah.
Well, and kind of getting back into the business.
I think as we diversified, I think Fred would have seen the changing times. He was very much plugged into what was going on with the economy, what was going on with his industry. And, we went through some boom and bust periods. And I think he would have seen, that opportunity to sort of soften the curve as a wise move.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so from a business standpoint, it always seemed what I had read, and it was clear that Fred was concerned about business aspects of it, right? Yeah. He was a businessman at heart, I think.
Yep.
So that was always his thing. And I'm always just amazed by the timeline of how they got things done.
Oh, that's insane.
6 months, 8 months, whatever it was. Here they are from a drawing in New Jersey on a drafting table, which you would have wondered what that would have been like in that garage, right? With these people, brilliant people together.
Yeah.
Talking about it and eating lunch there, probably,
Yeah.
and probably sleeping there from time to time, and how they came up with it.
And think about what it takes today to make a part, to get authorization to
Right.
make a part. These
Right.
guys, these guys with a total, by the way, at the end of the year, with a total of 33 people,
Yep.
not only turned out an engine, but got all of those parts out for out to get built. They got them
Yeah.
all certified. They got them all brought through. Interesting. There's even a piece where they call on Gene Wilson, who worked for Moffett at the Air Force. Gene ends up actually running United Aircraft
Yeah.
during the Second World War. But they call on Wilson and say, hey, can you have your inspector clear those forgings for us so we can get this thing done?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, all of these, understanding who you can reach out to make sure that you're moving things along at the speed of light.
Yeah.
In order to get that first wasp done so the turkey's on the table on Christmas Day.
It's amazing. And you mentioned Wyman Gordon, still in business.
Yep. Still an important supplier.
Still a very important supplier. So they were the ones that furnished the castings for the cylinders. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
And they were in Massachusetts.
They were in Worcester at the time.
Worcester at the time. Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, it's there again, relationships that last for
Yeah.
a century, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's pretty incredible. But I think the story, like I said, if you think about Fred growing up in this environment.
Yep.
And really starting to shine when he brings his own team together. That's the key.
Yeah.
For him, it was about pulling together. It was about, like I said, that intellectual curiosity that he had about understanding not only how the business worked, but how every part functioned. So there's a wonderful picture of Fred and Andrew Wilgoose and Don Brown, who ran the factory, and Colonel Deeds, sort of all around a print.
Yeah.
And they're all putting in, because it's, well, how are we going to manufacture this? How are we going to make it? And you think about, the things that they did differently for an engine. And it wasn't that there were inventions in that first Wasp,
No.
so much as they took all of the best stuff that was out there anywhere and put it in together.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it's just amazing how 5 or 6 people could come together and make this all happen.
Yep.
And it's, I've always said the aviation is it's a small business. It's a small world of people. You meet them and then you'll meet them again and you'll meet
Right.
them again and you'll meet them again. But this is the whole relationship. I would have thought that maybe the forgings would have came from Hamilton.
Yeah.
So, maybe that's how the
Maybe
story
that
is
was
going to
the
be
connection.
spun. Maybe
Yeah.
you're going to spin it through there, but
Well,
didn't quite get there. But
it's interesting when you think about
Small world.
the Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce and you think about the Manufacturing Association.
Yeah.
Everybody knew I mean, before Fred was pushed to buy Lawrence,
Yeah.
he knew Charles Lawrence. I mean, this wasn't new. The conversations between he and Chance Vaught don't start when he's building the Wasp. They actually started when Chance Vaught was flying with a Hispano-Suiza engine in his aircraft,
okay.
the VE7 and the VE9, that were vaunted aircraft at the time. I mean, those relationships all build on each other.
Yeah.
And I think the reputations grew at the time and allowed them to do what they did.
Sure. Now, just in a few quick moments, what is Laurent's relationship? I mean, where did he come from?
So
It's going to be hard for you to do it in a few moments. but
it is.
but-
So Lawrence comes as another one who had a silver spoon in his mouth. He went to MIT. Coming out of MIT, he tried to start a car company. It didn't really work. He ended up going to study with Eiffel, as in Eiffel Tower fame.
Yep.
But he studied aeronautics there, and with that's where he was exposed to air-cooled engines, and it was that knowledge that he brought back to the United States to form the
okay.
Lawrence Aero Engine Company.
Yeah. One person is more interested to hear about Fred's father. You mentioned he was a true rags to riches story. Can you briefly just share a little bit more?
Fred's father, old Adam, it really is remarkable. Like I said, I touched on the fact that he came in. He came over from Württemberg in what today is Germany with his father as an infant, along with his siblings. When his father died, he was only 11, and he had to go help support the family. He went into the foundries in Newark. He learned the trade there, got married in Newark, followed his in-laws to Indiana, but stayed in the foundry business. His young wife then died, leaving him with 2 sons, who he initially left with his in-laws. He then went to Indianapolis to run a foundry for a company, then to Cincinnati, until landing in Hamilton, where he found a partner to start up the Ohio foundry business. But it was really his depth of knowledge. This was a guy who was a good businessman, but it was his technical expertise in the casting business that allowed him to make parts. And I know you can't see it from there, but allowed him to make tiny parts like this that are I can't imagine how you build these as a casting, and at the same time have a business that not only does something like this, but can do the flywheel for one of those coreless engines that's 20 feet in diameter, that they've dug the mold into the floor. I mean, just a brilliant guy, just a remarkable and disciplined and committed to his family and what was best for them.
Yeah. Okay. Another question: are there any historic sites in Hamilton that reflect the Pratt Whitney history?
Interesting. So I've been to the Butler County Historical Society, and there's a good deal of information on Rentschler and the histories there. Interestingly enough, as Fred was growing up, the only we'll call it skyscraper, it was 8 stories tall, building in town is the Rentschler building. That is still there.
Huh?
So the Rentschler name carries a lot of weight in the town, as it should. And interestingly enough, the Miami Conservancy District continues to this day to have a Rentschler on its board.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, it's been a very interesting hour. I never thought there was so much history before Fred Rentschler. I mean, that's where we all start our story, with this, like I said, it's $250,000 of West Hartford and down at Capitol Avenue, but a real interesting story. We really like to thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Jim.
Great story. Looking forward to seeing what your 450 pages turn out to be.
We'll see. I am too.
And we'd be more than glad to have you back at some time to give us more of your story as it rolls out. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending today. This was great. New England Air Museum, thanks. Always great hosts up here in Windsor Locks. And to Debbie and to Betty, thanks for your help. Without you two, it wouldn't have ever happened today. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.